What is going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I'm starting today with the Scream list, and my reasoning for that is very simple. The day of recording this, I went 30-8 in High Infinite with this deck. It feels incredibly powerful and immensely well positioned. It has the ability to use Scream on turn 2 in order to make sure that decks like Surtur never actually manage to get set up. It has a ton of incredibly powerful 2-drops, all of which are really strong in this deck, which is a massive departure from what Scream was previously. There are 4 incredible 2-drops in this deck, and then your worst 2-drop is a 2/4. That is so incredibly good for you because it makes this deck so much more forgiving than it used to be. It used to be that if you had your 2-drop and you played that and then you drew Scream, it would be impossible for you to actually get Scream out and get value out of it because everything you would pair with Scream cost a lot. But now you play your 2-drop, you play your 3-drop, and then you have Scream and Spider-Man on turn 4. This goes so far towards making this deck a more flexible and powerful deck as opposed to the one that has been on rails since Scream came out. I think this is the strongest this deck has been. I certainly feel that it has the tools needed to compete with basically everything. You can go over the top of things, or more accurately, go under things with Cannonball, clog up lanes with Polaris and Arrow, apply negative power to stuff, make sure that you don't get clogged with Sam and Hydra Bob. You just have a bunch of stuff, basically. Your big risk is that sometimes you'll run into a mid-range deck or something that's just going over the top of you and also plays Luke Cage. You're not exactly the most well-positioned into the Hazmat, Luke Cage, Anti-Venom Malekith decks. You can do stuff, but a lot of the time they really can mess you up with that Luke Cage, preventing your Scream from gaining any power. You end up being a deck that needs to clog and then Cannonball to win those matchups, which is not necessarily a reliable strategy. You can also run into problems when you're not able to stop a Surtur from snowballing downhill. Again, though, you can do your Clog Cannonball strategy as a backup here. You just have a lot of very good cards that all work well together, that all add up into a package that has a lot of answers for a variety of situations that the game can throw at you. There were a large amount of comments talking about how Surtur was just dead after the nerf. I thought this was pretty ridiculous on its face. I was pretty sure Surtur would still be good, and if I'm keeping score, I think it's KM Best 1 and Internet Commenters 0 on this one, because this deck is absolutely still good. It's so good that it has a target on its back still. It's so good that when I was talking about what I thought might be the best deck in the game 10 seconds ago, part of why I thought it was the best deck in the game is that you get to bully this deck with its Scream lines. And I think that that is really worth talking about. Like, yeah, there is a pretty high floor on how bad this deck is allowed to get. And what they allowed Surtur to still do is most of his job. People are out here like, oh, he's only a 3/11. He's unplayable now. What are you talking about? He is still the best 3-drop in the game by a pretty wide margin in the deck that he's in. He's the only 3-drop in the game that this deck actually wants to see, and there's just really no excuse for thinking that this deck would fall off a cliff because they got rid of this. If anything, it's a little bit better because people were like, oh, well, I don't have to worry about this anymore. I'm gonna cut my Mobius, and now I'm just gonna lose every time Skaar shows up. This deck is extremely strong. The nut draws are exactly as good as you remember it. And frankly, I think you should be showing up with a plan for what this deck can do. If you think your deck is going to be one of the best decks in the game, you cannot ignore this matchup. It is so real, and it is still very good. One of the big changes that the patch brought was this list coming back to prominence. I did a video on it just yesterday, so I won't belabor the point here, but it's a very powerful mid-range deck, and I think a lot of people miss how wide-ranging and applicable to various situations the Afflict package is. If you look at this and just see, oh, it's a pile of Afflict cards, that is true, but it's worth taking a look at how each of those Afflict cards are better in certain situations and worse in other situations. An example would be Scorpion and Cassandra Nova. Those are the cards you want to see against a Surtur deck. Then you have your, if you want to be playing against a Doom 2099 deck, the card you really want to see is US Agent, maybe a little bit of Hazmat. If you're playing against an Arishem deck, you really want to see Cassandra Nova, maybe an Ajax. If you're playing against a deck with a bunch of small guys, you really want to see a Man Thing. And so, you effectively have these cards that are at base great rate. Like, we're talking about Cassandra Nova, that's a 3/6 plus. Scorpion is a 2/3 plus. US Agent is a 2/3 plus. And so all of these cards are great on rate, but they also have specific matchups where they're like double or triple that rate. Effectively, they're a bunch of tech cards that you don't even realize are tech cards. You just have tools for a bunch of different matchups built in because of how wide-ranging your Afflict stuff is. The downside, of course, is that when you are an Afflict deck, you lose when your opponent plays Luke Cage, because all of your tech, quote-unquote, is dependent on Afflicts actually happening. And so if they're not, you're in a ton of trouble. You will get some people if you play this deck. Like, yes, there are very prominent L's to Luke Cage. Yes, Luke Cage is coming back in force. Yes, most things that aren't playing Luke Cage are just not doing that because they were like, well, I'm still playing this Mobius. Yes, you are weak to that too. But if you're looking for something that is under the radar, a little bit more unknown, this twist on the Ajax archetype is extremely powerful. This is a deck that is looking to play a turn 5 Hazmat and then do turn 6 a bunch of power. You can have turn 5 Hazmat with a move or something like that into Miles Morales plus Abomination plus Ajax. It is a Moon Girl-esque level of point dumping here that is just an immensely powerful approach. Downside, you are running High Evolutionary for literally one card. Downside also, now that this deck has been on the tier list, I think people might understand what's going on. I think this deck gets a lot of value because people think you're the other deck, and they never play around what you can actually do on the final turn of the game. If people start recognizing this as the legitimate metagame threat that it is, then you are going to be in a little more trouble. A lot of the upsides and downsides that we talked about in the previous list also apply to you. You just have a little more explosiveness and a little less in the way of glue cards. This might be the first time ever that Grandmaster is legitimately making it onto the tier list in one of the better decks in the game. And the major reason for that is that when people are playing Mobius or other ways to stop your combo, having that Dakin be able to go off twice is usually going to be enough points with that 16/16 in order for you to just make it be what you're happy with, right? So you have that, you have Frigga, you have Grandmaster. They're playing a Mobius, that's a 3/3. It takes all your other nut draws off the table, but as long as you have that Frigga and that Grandmaster, you can even get to 32 and 32. And that kind of stuff is what's really, really helpful when your opponents are counting on a Mobius to drag your point total down. Like, it's still not the greatest thing in the world to see a Mobius, and you are happy that there are less of those, but this is definitely a deck where you're just like, I would like that second option so that if people come prepared for Mobius, I can still play a powerful strategy against them. And that's part of what Grandmaster is adding, and I think that's the major reason why I like him right now. I know there are going to be people who are like, no, I actually use Grandmaster to, make sure my MODOK happens twice. It's like, yeah, no, that stuff is cool. But I think the reason he's here now is very explicitly Mobius related, giving you a way of getting very tall in a world where people are preventing you from doing that via the world's largest collectors and Morbii. It's pretty hard for Arishem to actually be all that bad. I do think it got a little worse, and I also think that there's definitely work to be done in terms of figuring out what the exact best list is. Right now, I've been playing this, but I think Mobius is a flex slot. I think Enchantress is a flex slot. I think even Shang-Chi is a flex slot. I'd be interested in trying Lady Deathstrike, Juggernaut, Red Guardian. There's just stuff that I think needs to be experimented on with this deck. Like, I don't think this is by any means bad, but I think if you're like an Arishem gamer, what you need to do is figure out what you think is great into this metagame, what it is that you are going to be able to bring to the table, and what it is that you can use to scam people. And Lady Deathstrike seems like a pretty good option there. There's just a bunch of stuff that makes a lot of sense for this deck right now, and figuring out what the best versions of those are, it's a little bit difficult because right now we have a version of it that has a little bit of an additional edge against discard, a little bit of an additional edge against ongoing decks, and it has a Shang-Chi, which is never going to be all that bad, but I don't think it's as required as you might think. This is a powerful deck. I don't want anyone to approach this and be like, oh, it's not that good. This deck is strong, but those 3 flex slots, those 3 tech cards, I think that's where the optimization that you can put in is going to be found. We've discussed a fairly reasonable amount of decks that are relatively weak to Luke Cage so far, so it's probably worth talking about what I think the best starting place is for if you want to play a Luke Cage deck and try to beat these guys. And I think it is probably this. Like, this is just a deck that has all the reasons in the world to be playing a Luke Cage. You are obviously very happy being an anti-venom deck with Luke Cage. You love that. But the real reason we're doing this is the same reason why we were playing Mobius in here previously. It's basically just so that we have the ability to hook a tech card that does not have a lot of wide application up to an engine that can go over the top of stuff. And so if you want to put something like Mobius back in the deck for either Juggernaut or for Shadow King, I think that is perfectly 100% acceptable. This is a deck that is effectively an engine that needs to be respected, and figuring out what the space to do with those tech cards is really how you're going to be able to keep up in the metagame. So if you're seeing a lot of Scream, if you're seeing a lot of discard, Mobius might still be the move. It might just be the right thing to be doing. I've enjoyed this setup, but I can totally see a world where you would want Mobius and you're not seeing as much Scream or as much Hazmat, and you don't want Luke Cage. I personally would default to keeping Luke Cage and swapping out either Juggernaut or Shadow King, but you do you. Either way, the point here is this is an engine deck that you can put cheap, and this is also crucial. Cards like Mobius and Luke Cage can't go in every deck because they just get outpointed, right? You have to have an engine hooked up to it that can scale higher than them. So if you're playing against Surtur with a Mobius, you're playing against Ajax with a Luke Cage, that's amazing, but you still need points. And that means you need the most efficient points engine. If you're going to play a 3-2 or a 3-3, you need a bunch of points very cheap. And this deck is excellent at doing exactly that. Just a quick alternate V-hand build from KM Worst, the Clog version of this deck, attempting to leverage not the tech cards, but instead a mid-rangey Clog strategy, which I think is a unique and fun take on the list that you can absolutely try and really will get people with, but I do worry that it sort of flattens the cube equity. You're going to have to be really on top of snaps, and you're going to have to assume that people don't know what you're doing Clog-wise and aren't willing to play around it because they think you're the other deck. And if people are able to figure out what you're doing, or just like play cards that aren't necessarily easy to Clog, like Sam Wilson, like, you know, Jeff or Rocket and Groot or Hydra Bob or any of that stuff, then you can end up in a much more awkward situation. But the ethos here is the same. Rather than hooking up tech cards to the engine, they're hooking up Clog to the engine, and that is a similar thought process that allows you to output large amounts of points while also winning bad matchups just by virtue of being a Clog deck. Beeg Number's ongoing is unique in the sense that it can just afford to do whatever. Like, it doesn't have to worry about, like, is Mobius good right now? Is Luke Cage good right now? It can run both of them and just be like, what up? I'm playing both of these. You can't stop me because my entire top end just goes ridiculous. I do think that you kind of need a Luke Cage here because this deck specifically is so immensely vulnerable to the card US Agent, especially combined with a Hazmat, that you just like, I don't think you can reasonably win that matchup if they're playing that card, and I think you really need to be able to win that matchup, so we are on Luke Cage instead of the Super Skrull that many other people are playing. I think it's become less important to have a Super Skrull to win mirrors because there are just less mirrors of this deck, and it has become more important to have the Luke Cage because holy crap, there are so many things that Luke Cage is good against right now. So being able to be both a Luke Cage and a Mobius deck is pretty sweet, and you have this ability to they might not necessarily expect either of those cards. Those can be snaps in certain matchups. And then your point package with Doom 2099, Doom, Spectrum, all the big boys is legitimately really strong, and it helps make up for the fact that you're playing some pretty mediocre bodies in the early game, but you don't even have to play those mediocre bodies. You have Sam Wilson, you have Captain America, you just have a lot of stuff. And now you are a little bit vulnerable to decks that are able to go super tall in 2 lanes. That's really not something you're happy to see, but you have a lot of power against basically everything else. Mill is a vaguely acceptable deck. It really gets prominent in metagames where there's a lot of like demoning going on, and we're not exactly in one of those, but it is possible that we're moving towards one. Mill also gets prominent in metagames where there's a lot of Iron Patrioting going on, and I think we're a little bit more in one of those than we previously were. There are some good indicators for this deck, is really what I'm trying to get across. They're not like the most compelling indicators of all time, but there are some pretty reasonable and good indicators that are suggesting good things for what this deck can do. It is still, and basically always has been, the mid-range deck that is good into other Iron Patriot mid-range decks. If you're running into like the V-hand stuff, this absolutely puts it in the dumpster. This is a good deck with a lot of strong cards in it. It gets to go over the top of other mid-range decks with Death. It gets to blow up Mobius with Lady Deathstrike, which is a more recent addition. The power here is very real and very strong. It is yet another Misery Hood deck. You get a lot of numbers on the board. You have relevant tech cards. There's a lot to be said for this deck. I also think it's like almost the very definition of mid because of the fact that you are doing this mill stuff. Like you are going to have... You're playing the card Yondu. The card Yondu is not a good card. Like we can be real about that. We can be honest about it. You're also a very known factor as a deck, which is part of why I'm enjoying the Lady Deathstrike instead of the Red Guardian, because Lady Deathstrike at least can still catch people by surprise and add some points to that death counter, where Red Guardian I don't think is catching anyone by surprise and got a lot worse with Sam Wilson coming out. The deck is, I think, on like an upward trajectory. I just don't know if we've hit the point at which I'm willing to be like, yes, it's Miller time. The Sarah-less Sarah control deck here, which I believe was made by Chamo. Multiple people told me that last time, and I think it is still a functional, reasonable deck. There's nothing objectively wrong with this. It's just the kind of thing where it's like, all right, well, if your opponent knows what you're doing and is not going to get caught off guard with Enchantresses and Shangs, this deck does not have the points in it to really compete with what other things are doing. This is a deck where your tech needs to matter because you're like a pretty subpar mid-range deck outside of the fact that you have this really relevant tech, right? So there are a bunch of games where you like have Athena that's growing, you get to play Juggernaut Shang-Chi on the final turn of the game because your Shang-Chi got discounted by your Zabu, you're doing cool shit, right? Like you're into that. But that's actually not an amazing play if the Shang-Chi doesn't have a guaranteed hit, or if your opponent is playing Cosmo, or if your opponent is playing Juggernaut, or if your opponent is playing Armor. And it's like, if your turn 6 plays fail for basically any reason, and your opponent is able to like expect what's going on and play against it, this deck just doesn't have the points to win the easy games. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. Every game you play with this deck is going to be hard. And that's never a good sign. When I think of great decks, I think of decks that have a lot of built-in free easy wins. And right now, this one doesn't. If you are in the business of playing Adam Warlock, and I don't really think you should be in the business of playing Adam Warlock, I suspect that this might be the best place for him. What Adam Warlock really wants is to be part of a deck that sort of combos with itself. If you wanted to just draw generic cards, something like Cable or Kate Bishop is usually going to be better than Adam Warlock, right? But if you need specific cards, then Adam Warlock drawing even one card is going to be more valuable than anything random you could ever get. And I think Move Bounce is the kind of deck where it actually really wants what Warlock is selling, because this deck is always, and always has been, more than the sum of its parts. What it wants to be doing is getting consistent output of something large. And it does that by combining cards with each other, and there aren't good replacements for those cards that a randomly generated thing can give you. This is probably the best place to play Adam Warlock, and I'm not even sure that he's all that much better than Falcon. But if you are looking for a deck to play Warlock in, this is the one that makes the most sense to me. I don't care how much crap I'm going to take for this one. This deck isn't good. Adam Warlock, at the very least, isn't good in it. I am very sure at this point that Adam Warlock is not helping this deck, and that putting pretty much any other card in here would be a better option. I'm putting this on here because I see it a lot. I am obligated to talk about the fact that people are going to be playing this deck. Adam Warlock is not good here. There are very few cards in this deck that are the specific exact card that you need for a situation. And I realize there are going to be people who be like, KM, just don't play Red Guardian, play Rocket and Groot instead. KM, just don't play Cosmo, play Rocket and Groot instead, play Juggernaut instead. And it's like, yeah, okay, you can do all that and it can still be bad. Like, those are good cards to put in here, don't get me wrong, but that doesn't mean that you need to play Adam Warlock. Like, that's really what it keeps coming down to for me, is I think this deck was better before people started jamming Adam Warlock in it. And to me, that implies we shouldn't be jamming Adam Warlock in it. If you want to mess around with like Juggernaut, Rocket and Groot as your final cards instead of Red Guardian Cosmo, more power to you. Like, I am fully in support of that. But I don't think you want to be an Adam Warlock gamer. I think at this point, we're all pretty clear on what Mr. Negative is. This is the bully snap if you get your nut draw deck and hope they don't have any of the stuff that beats you. If they do not have a Mobius, you are almost certainly going to win the game. It'll require some serious shenanigans for you to not win a Mr. Negative game, especially if you get it to turn 7 or draw cards off Jane Foster. It's just not going to be an easy game for you to lose. It's a very powerful deck. The addition of Gore to it has really sort of changed how I thought about Mr. Negative, in the sense that I used to think of Mr. Negative as a deck where it's like, oh, it doesn't really matter if you add more top end to it. That's whatever, right? Like, you added more top end to a deck that was already infinite top end. But Gore is just good enough that, like, it gives you the ability to win even games where you're not a Mr. Negative deck. Like, literally just Gore Mystique will beat some of these decks some of the time. That's messed up. That's just a really crazy thing that is actually 100% true, and you can just win games off of that. And, of course, after a Mr. Negative, it's like the world's freest thing. You're getting 20 power off of Gore, maybe you Taskmaster the Gore, just ridiculous numbers all across the board, everything you want from a deck. It's very hard to lose. It usually takes like some kind of Goliath or Juggernaut or location shenanigans for that to happen, but you can. But against basically everything else, this is just free if you get to turn 6 and your hand is good enough. These decks are down this far on the tier list, not because they're bad, just because I think that they're a worse version of the other Scream deck. I realized that, of course, I think that. I went 30-8 with the other deck. Why would I not think that it's the better version of the deck? I think that this deck is fine and reasonable and even good. It's just that a lot of what it gets is like Heimdall jukes, Magneto jukes. If anything, this deck reminds me a lot of the old Heimdall move deck, where your turn 6 is just wholly inscrutable and you have no idea what they're going to actually do, whether they're going to Heimdall to move their 10s out of the lane you're going to Shang-Chi them, or whether they're going to Magneto somewhere else entirely and mess up all your math. Ultimately, that is what this deck is preying on. This is a deck that has a lot of points and then the world's most confusing turn 6. That makes it a relevant threat. I just kind of think the other Scream deck is doing that better. Scream 2099 is basically in the exact same position, but a little bit lower. I think this deck is probably going to be better the lower on ladder you are, because it is so much more on rails the lower on ladder you are, because this is a deck where it's like, if you're playing it like rank 70, you don't know much about, you know, specific metagame concerns, or even necessarily what your opponent is playing early in the game. But what you do know is that if you play Scream on 2 and Doom 2099 on 4, you're probably winning the game. And that's all you really need to know about this deck. You get good numbers. A member of my Discord named SMLZ has been playing this teched out build of Surtur all the way up to the top 5. This is a very unique build, and I think Surtur's always in like an interesting spot in certain metagames where a lot of Surtur's power is dependent on A, how relevant its tech is to what other people are doing, and B, what the total ceiling of this metagame is in terms of points. And I think we can conclusively say that the total ceiling of this metagame is lower than it has been previously. We don't have discard running rampant without counters. People are playing like discard, but there's things people are doing to try to beat it, like Mobius, things of that nature. We don't have move bounce running around at a very high clip, which was just a very difficult matchup for this deck. Dagger got nerfed, so even in the world where you're running into move bounce, it's slightly worse against you than it would be otherwise, because you love filling up lanes in this deck, and Dagger was a big punish for that. So overall, I think that the general Surtur strategy is in a much better spot than it was previously, because it has relevant tech. 3-cost tech cards are extremely good right now, and the number of points that your opponent can output is not as high or not as much more than what you can do as it previously was. It's a good home for various tech cards, and I think this is a unique build. I'm not saying you have to play this build. I'm putting this one on there because, hey, Discord member did really well with it, and it's a slightly off-meta Surtur build. If you want to play the normal meta Surtur build, a lot of what I'm saying applies to that too. Do you hate playing Marvel Snap? Would you instead rather play slots? Then I have the deck for you. Hela will always allow you to roll dice, even in games you should definitely win or definitely lose. Numbers go big, but sometimes all your numbers go in same lane, and then you lose. Oh no, it's Hela. Like, this is the ultimate in coin flip decks. It's not even really a coin flip deck. It's not fair to call it a coin flip deck, because that's like, oh, like it happens one time. This is like a deck composed entirely out of coin flips. It is a slot machine deck. It is just generating random numbers, and then if the numbers are good for you, a little light pops up and it goes bing, and this is victory, and then you win. And that's Hela. That's pretty much it. Discard your cards, and then you bring them back, and then you really hope that they end up in the right spot. I'm not saying Zoo is great now, but I am saying that Zoo actually did get a meaningful buff from the addition of Sam Wilson, allowing you to run Sam and Captain America, which gives you some real tall going ability that not that you wouldn't necessarily have anyway, but it is like a pretty significant upgrade. Like, having this scaling 2-3 combo is pretty slick. Getting some additional points out of your 2s and your 3s and not being so dependent on only your go wide, and having the ability to go just a little bit taller. That stuff really does matter, because you only really have one guy who's ever going to be bigger than 10, and that's Gilgamesh. And so you have to figure out how to win other lanes against decks that go super tall, and having more value come out of your cards like your 2-drop and your 3-drop is a good way of making it so that 10 power Mockingbird after a blue Marvel is actually enough in the lane, as opposed to not being enough. This is a very reasonable deck. I think it has sort of fallen off in terms of play rate, but I would not be surprised if this was still just a very solid option, just based on how many points it is able to safely output. You're going to be able to put people in 50-50 situations a lot at the very worst. I had to choose what the last deck was going to be. It had to be either this or Destroy. As you can see, I chose this, which is not necessarily a referendum on this necessarily. This is the butt deck, of course. We had a video on it recently talking about how it is a rogue deck meant to attack certain metagames. we're not actually in a bad spot Galactus-wise. Like, it was originally built to attack discard. Galactus is very good at a discard. That makes perfect sense. But we are still in a metagame where it's like, if your opponent doesn't have an answer to the Black Panther stuff, they could just instantly die. This is a deck that is super dead when your opponent does have those answers. That is why there is a Kang in here, but it's also a bit of a meme deck. I can totally understand if you don't want to do that. You obviously should not craft Kang for any reason, including playing this deck. And of course, I do think it's worth pointing out that this is sort of like choosing between the last two kids at recess, because Destroy is and has been for a very long time just like a deeply mediocre deck that everyone knows what it does. And yes, you can win with it sometimes, because even a bad deck has a 45% win rate, which is winning almost half of your games. But it's just not good enough to justify its own existence, whereas at least this deck is attacking the metagame from a unique angle. Destroy is just doing a thing other decks are able to do, but it's doing that thing worse. And so when I have to choose which one's going to be the last deck we're going to talk about, I think it's pretty clear. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching that video. As always, remember to leave a comment, like, and subscribe if you made it this far. I have been KMB. I hope this helps you in your climb. I wish you the best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.